History is full of unlikely stories, but few are as strange as this. This is the story of how a small Swedish village ended up on the steppes of Ukraine, and how it still remains to this day. This is the tale of Gammalsvenskby. So where does this story start? Well, it actually has a very unexpected beginning, on this Estonian island, called Hiiumaa. But if you are a Swede, you would call it Dagö, which means Day Island. Now, this island had been populated by Swedes since like the 1200s, when the Teutonic Order, or more accurately, the Livonian Order ruled the island. It's under this time that the Swedes would get some special privileges in exchange for some money, which is something that will become very important later down the line, so keep this in mind. But in the coming years, the order would decline, and eventually, the Swedes would come in and take over. The Swedish rule on Dagö would start off pretty nice, with the Swedish settlers' privileges being reassured and respected by the Swedish crown. However, this would all come to a change since war and conquest came with one cost. Yeah, the cost. You see, war is expensive, and after Sweden successfully annexed Estonia, they continued this trend and annexed a bunch of more land, turning Sweden into an empire. However, the Swedish crown didn't really have the money to pay for all this. So how did they finance it? Well, they actually borrowed money, mainly from rich counts. Now, the plan was to first plunder and then take the new taxes these territories would bring in and hope that that would be enough to cover their debts. However, funnily enough, this didn't work. As the debt piled up and the counts started demanding their money back, the Swedish king had little to no choice than to start granting the conquered lands as payment. This is how the Duchy of Estonia, which included Dagö, ended up in the hands of a count, Count Jacob de la Gardie. He quickly grew to despise his Swedish subjects, since he couldn't tax them as heavily as the Estonians. You see, the Estonians were serfs, and they had been that ever since the 13th century. Now, being a serf wasn't that nice. You were bound to the land, had to work for a lord, and give up a bunch of your harvest. Basically a middle ground between a free peasant and a slave. And while the Swedish king had tried to improve their rights, this came nowhere in the local courts, which were packed with German landowners. Meanwhile, the privileges the Swedish peasants enjoyed were much less harsh. They were not bound to the land, and they didn't need to give up as much of their harvest. But the count obviously didn't like this, since this came at the cost of him. This all sparked decades of legal battles between the count and the Swedish peasants, which gradually saw the Swedes' rights being weakened. However, the story takes a turn for the worst after one big event. As you all know, all empires eventually fall, and now it was Sweden's turn. The Great Northern War started off pretty strong for Sweden, but it would eventually go sour, ending with them ceding all of this, importantly Dagö, to Russia. It's now when the Russians take over that the story gets even more messy. You see, the first thing the Russians did was to kick out the Swedish count, and instead let the other German nobles run the island. These nobles came to respect the Swedes' personal freedoms, but they demanded the same taxation as the Estonians, which the Swedish peasants begrudgingly accepted. Now, the Swedish peasants had tried to get their rights reaffirmed with the Russian king, but he never confirmed them. However, he didn't deny them either, which meant their rights were basically stuck in limbo. Then we have an important statement by the Russian courts in 1740, which deemed Estonians as the private property of the landlord, basically pushing them closer to slavery on the chart. While this court ruling didn't include the Swedes, this raised concerns among them, since they knew they very well could be next. And then, 15 years later, this reality would come even closer, because an old enemy would reappear. You know him, you love him. It's Count de la Gardie, only his great-granddaughter now. So yeah, in 1755, the now Russian Queen Catherine the Great granted the island back to her, mainly as she had married the influential Count Stenbock, who were good friends with Catherine. But it's when their son Carl Magnus Stenbock inherits the island that the real conflicts with the Swedish villagers flare up again. However, this time would be different, as the new count had an idea that just might work. You see, he knew a guy called Potemkin. Who is Potemkin? Well, shortly speaking, at the time, he was one of the most powerful men in the entire Russian Empire. And you see, he was appointed to populate and modernize these newly conquered lands from the Ottoman Empire, called Novorossiya, or New Russia in English. He was tasked to do this as quickly as possible, so to entice new settlers into moving and ensuring loyalty, he got to give out a bunch of attractive incentives, like free land, religious freedom, and stuff like that. But 5 years into the project, and there were still a bunch of lands uncolonized, mainly in the Crimean Khanate, which technically was a separate entity, but effectively just a Russian puppet, and would soon be fully annexed. But anyways, the idea was to get the Swedes involved in the project, and wouldn't you guess it, Potemkin loved that idea. So he quickly sent over a representative to Dagö, who gathered the Swedes and laid out the offer, and it looked something like this. The Swedes would get a little less than 13,000 hectares of land for free, with houses and stone fields already prepared for their arrival. The land was located down here, right beside the Dnipro River, but that wasn't the end of it. They would also get religious freedom, a period of tax exemption, and be granted interest-free loans to buy stuff like farm equipment and cattle. Now this deal seemed pretty good. While this technically wasn't a forced migration, since they could have just declined the offer, they knew very well that if they didn't accept this deal, their fate would probably be the same as the Estonians, which is why around 75% of the Swedes accepted. However, this journey quickly turned out to be disastrous. A quarter of the population had already died just on the way down to these new lands, and when they finally arrived a year later, things didn't get much better. The Swedes struggled to adjust to a new unfamiliar climate, and the houses and stone fields they had been promised were nowhere to be found. But even with this bad start, the Swedes fought through and founded their new village, which they would simply call Svenskby, or Swedish village. However, as time went on, Old was added to the name as the village grew older, but also to differentiate it from other settlements. Now you might think that the worst must have been over for the Swedes, and that it was only smooth sailing from here. But then you would be wrong, since something far worse was about to strike the village. It was disease, and it hit the village hard. It swept through the entire community, killing even more, and by 1783, just 3 years after they had agreed to do all this, only about 130 people were left, which means around 90% had either died or fled the village. This massive loss quickly turned into another problem. With so many Swedes dead, there simply weren't enough people left to work the land they had been given. The Russians, who eventually noticed this, fixed the problem by inviting more Germans to the area. These Germans subsequently set up 3 new villages and began to take over the land that was originally granted to the Swedes. This obviously strained the relationship between the Swedes and the Germans, but as they were both in a foreign land, far away from their homelands, this never turned into a conflict, and intermarriage was very common. By the late 19th century, the Industrial Revolution began to change everything. Advances in technology and transportation finally made regular communication possible between Gammalsvenskby and Sweden. This came with many benefits, the most notable being that when the village church burned down, the news could now reach Sweden, which resulted in Swedish citizens raising funds to help rebuild it. But just as the future looked great, things would change with one big event. As you know, World War I didn't go that well for Russia. After 3 years of war, the empire collapsed, and the communist revolution plunged the land into chaos. This cut off the contact with Sweden and Gammalsvenskby, and it wasn't until things calmed down in 1922, when the Soviet Union was formed, that Sweden was finally able to send an expedition with much needed aid to the village. Not long after that, the Swedish villagers asked for the right to leave the Soviet Union and to be sent to Sweden. And after 2 years of pleading, this request was finally accepted in 1929. So Sweden organized another expedition to bring them home, which resulted in basically every Swede from Gammalsvenskby leaving the Soviet Union, and this is how their journey home looked like. The villagers were first brought down to Kherson, where they boarded 2 steamships that carried them across the Black Sea to the Romanian port of Constance. Then by train, they traveled across Europe, passing through many nations before finally arriving at the German port of Sassnitz, where they then took the ferry over to Sweden's southernmost town, Trelleborg. The people of Gammalsvenskby were cheered upon as they stepped off the boat and into Sweden. Now, for the first time in their life, they could actually see the magical land that they had heard so many stories about from their ancestors. Finally, they were home. Could anything possibly go wrong now? As it turns out, yes, very wrong.